Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very great pleasure to be here, to have heard the welcoming speech, slightly to recast what, forgive me, what I want to say in the light of it. Yes, this is an organization which calls itself the New Culture Forum. Culture is important. But ladies and gentlemen, if we are to be conservatives, dare I say, the elegant nothings of an Oakeshott don't actually make it. They really do not. We need tougher, stronger political thoughts. And I'm afraid Scruton doesn't make it either. What I want to argue for is a conservatism that is a real conservatism, that is firmly grounded in the political realities of the Anglo-British Constitution. This was always the traditional anchor of conservatism. It got swept away with Thatcherism's unfortunate substitution of free market economics for conservatism, a disaster. It was necessary, but as an act of substitution, it was a disaster. But what it entails, of course, is, again, what was actually being said just then, a huge act of repossession. We were wandering around the term to use when you undo terrible changes. We've, of course, done it before. We had something as bad as the Blairite Revolution because we had a real revolution, the revolution of the 17th century. And we followed it with a restoration. What we should be talking about is restoration. And what I'm going to try to investigate with you now, and of course, beginning with Magna Carta, because that's where it actually begins, is the origin of that thing that in the last 30 years we've largely thrown away and so fully destroyed. But enough of the lineaments are there, the history is there, the documents, the places, it's still possible to do it, but only just. And at the same time, I want to do something else. I want to present you with a different version of Magna Carta itself. I want to present it to you as a conservative document, not a radical one, or rather a document that becomes conservative. Because remember, everything is in time. It isn't just a thing in itself. It's not just a thing in itself. Magna Carta is a repeat performance. There are dozens of versions of Magna Carta. And particularly in the first 10 years, from 1215 to 1225, you get the future made by those changes. But the other most important thing is it is political. The foundation of our values isn't philosophy. It's not abstract reasoning. It is real people performing real acts in real time. And this is what we've got to go back to. The abstractions of so-called political philosophy are the disaster. The absurdities of international liberalism are the disaster. Conservatism, by definition, is national. It's culturally rooted. It's a product of a specific history, of a specific place, of Runnymede, of Lincoln, of London, of the Temple. And it's that sense of place and locality and specificity and particular individuals, including our first great conservative statesman, William the Marshal, Earl of Pembroke. So that's the overall structure. What I want to do, and also, I found this terribly interesting. I wrote this book 10 years ago. And what strikes me is how little, and I regard myself as being pretty perceptive and pretty on the ball, because as you know, I don't suffer, as my history master said at the beginning of in my first sixth form report, Starkey does not suffer from any notions of modesty. Well, that is indeed. I think actually he phrased it even better, conspicuously lacks the virtue of modesty. But what struck me was, looking back, even in 1215, I didn't realize what the damage had been. I didn't realize what the Blair Revolution had done, which I now do. Right, so let's now begin this process of re-examining and reshaping Magna Carta itself. Now, obviously, I'm going to immediately undo one thing that I've said. The original Magna Carta of 1215 is a revolutionary document. It is a direct product of violence and revolution. Can we also be absolutely clear, if that Magna Carta had survived, our history would be incomparably different and utterly disastrous. The sentimentalization of the 1215 Magna Carta is a product of mere Victorian mythologizing. Because what that Magna Carta would have done would have turned us into a Poland or a Hungary. It would have turned us into an aristocratic republic with catastrophic consequences. Let me just spell out very quickly. The Magna Carta really falls into two very distinct sections, three actually. The first, the famous chapter 1 on the liberties of the church, is tacked on the very last stage of the process by Stephen Langton. The rest of the chapters we essentially know about because they exist in the Articles of the Barons. It's the first time in English history we've actually got a draft of a document. We've got the Barons' proposals which were really submitted to Richard. And the whole early stage of that document, it's very striking. It's described again. There are wonderful chroniclers' accounts of all of this. The document is described as being under heads. In other words, it's exactly like a modern drafting document. You've blobs in the margin. These are the points. And generally speaking, they're just quick summaries. Summaries about how we sort out the business of inheritance. Summaries about the treatment of widows. Summaries that take account of the fact that one of the fundamental reasons that the barons have got the king over a barrel is very simple. They've got London. So, of course, and remember, every revolution in Anglo-British history depends on the rebels getting possession of London. Once you've got that, you've really got the country. That's what undoes Charles I. That's what undoes James II. That's what undid John. So, of course, the demands of London, which is why Magna Carta contains these astonishingly precocious notions of uniform weights and measures. We're the first country actually to have uniform weights and measures, for the abolition of internal tolls, for, again, very striking, I've now been talking, as it were, in relatively abstract terms, but of course, one of the baronial leaders, Robert Fitzwalter, had got very strong connections. You can see him, a sort of big, bad baron, in the kind of phrase of Gilbert and Sullivan, big, bad baronet, a big, bad baron. He'd strong connections with the London wine trade. So, of course, the Vittlers get their cut into it. And all of these things are just listed as very, very quick heads, because they're going to be written up, once the consent of the king has been extorted, they'll be written up by the highly expert clerks of the Chancery. Remember, the reign of John, although in most ways it is regarded as a Urbad reign of Urbad king, sees an enormous expansion in the bureaucracy, the written apparatus of English government. His predecessors, Henry I, Henry II, had begun the process of developing the law, of developing the administration, of developing the exchequer, which meant that England, with the possible exception of Norman Sicily, had by far the most most sophisticated royal administration in Europe. And the writing office, the chancery, is at the center of this. But John introduces the novel feature, which I and countless generations of historians before me have used, the enrolling of documents. You actually keep a record of documents going out. And so the whole operation of the Charter, its drafting, its writing up, the circulation of the copies, the writs that follow and so on, is all a testimony to John's aggressive development of royal administration as an instrument of tyranny that is then turned against him. But the very striking thing about the Articles is there's one clause which is absolutely fully written out, which the barons do not trust to the machinery of the king's chancery, and it's called the forma securitatis, the form and manner of security. That's exactly what it is. And what it does, and why I said this is a genuinely revolutionary document, it asks the question, how can we hold John to account? How can we hold this king whose word is worthless, who has been prepared to betray everybody without even thinking about it? How can we hold him to account? And what they do it by genuinely revolutionary means. You set up what amounts to a committee of public safety, a committee of 25 barons who are to be self-recruiting. In other words, if one drops out, they can choose another. 4 of them constitute a quorum. Everybody in England has to renounce their oath of allegiance, listen to this, renounce their oath of allegiance to the king and swear an oath to the 25. And also, the king instructs his subjects to take seriously a command from the 25 that if he refuses to accept their judgment, because remember, there's a whole series of cases, because John has been so aggressive in taking possession of the barons' goods, obviously there've got to be a series of judgments to restore them. Interestingly, the barons are going to be judging their own cases and restoring their own property. This gives you an idea of how it's going to work. And at the same time, the king's subjects are instructed that if the king resists, they are to join with the barons and pursue the king to the uttermost in all his property, his men, and everything else, sparing only the life of the king, his wife, the queen, and their children. A license of civil war. Now that, you see what I mean when I say this is genuinely revolutionary. It is genuinely revolutionary. John has to sign it. He's got no choice in the matter, as we know. This is why all the good bits at the front of the Charter, the noble declarations about the church, the rather windy stuff on justice, the very important stuff on consent for taxation, the definition of the commune and all the rest of it, why all those very good things are, as it were, fundamentally flawed by this dreadful end, which would have been exactly the sort of radicalism that was denounced before me, in the speech before me. That is part of Magna Carta. What happens to it? Why does not that survive? Well, the process is, of course, as we all know, and I'm not going to go through it in detail because it'll take far too long, and I just want to block the big points out. As we know, Magna Carta is very quickly declared illegal by the Pope. It survives only from June until the autumn. The Magna Carta of 1215, and it's declared in the most absolutely uncompromising language by Pope Innocent III. Remember, Innocent III is now overlord of England because the Pope has surrendered England to the Pope as a fief. He's also the most aggressive, the most able, and the most forceful of the great medieval popes. He's in the middle of the great Lateran Council of 1215, which itself profoundly affects England. I mean, one of the many things, many misunderstandings of Magna Carta that you'll hear is that it founds jury trial. Of course it doesn't. There are no juries. At this point, you're tried by combat. But it's Innocent who abolishes the Christian rights of combat, and therefore you have to come up with other forms of examination of justice. Continental Europe goes for torture. It goes for the Roman method. No, do we all not realize this? This is the great difference between English law and Roman law. Every criminal who is not noble in Roman law is tortured into a confession. It is the most abominable system of justice. As early as the 15th century, English lawyers are denouncing it as intolerable, as inhumane, as an affront to civilization. In other words, our objections to torture aren't newfangled things like the European Convention on Human Rights. They're embedded deep in an absolutely distinct common law tradition. But anyway, Innocent III, because of course John is his protege, regards this charter, which completely subverts the notion of royal sovereignty, as an affront not simply to the king but to him, and he declares it an abomination before God. All the wonderful language of the Roman chancery, the diapason organ of Latin rolling out, to be utterly extirpate, abolished, declared abominable in the sight of God, man, and all the rest of it. Are the barons in the least put out of countenance by this? Not a whit. But on the other hand, it does enable John to begin his fight back, and the slow fight back begins with the most important thing. Remember, he still preserves considerable numbers of his quantities of his dominions in France, with an access to men, money, and troops and mercenaries and whatever from there. And the crucial thing is the road from Dover to England and the crossing of the Medway. I just passed it today when coming up from Kent at Rochester. And when John wins the Battle of Rochester, at least there's something like a chance. And the balance of power begins now to swing towards the king. Remember, the barons, and again, it's exactly like the beginning of the Civil War of the 1640s, the barons have now done the absolute unforgivable. They have committed treason. Their lives are at stake. And again, one of the remarkable outcomes, and I want to emphasize this, is that when the whole business is finally settled, treason is not involved, despite their overt committing treason. How do you protect yourself if you renounced allegiance to one king? You've got to find another one. So what the barons do is exactly what we're going to see happen time after time, the last and the most flamboyant being 1689, when the Whig and Tory lords bring in William of Orange. You're going to bring in a foreign ruler with foreign strength. So the barons do that most unforgivable of things, even for French-speaking Englishmen, and they surrender England to the French. They surrender it to Prince Louis, the son of the King of France. Now, the fascinating thing is, they do it on terms, but they do not insist that Louis subscribes to the charter. This is absolutely fascinating, because again, if you go forward to 1688-89, the first thing that the Lords do in 1688-89 is to make sure that William and Mary are absolutely committed to the Bill of Rights. You sign that or you don't get the crown. The barons didn't do it. We do not know why. Perhaps they didn't take it very seriously themselves. Perhaps Louis, the French had a much higher, in many ways, a much more elevated view of monarchy than the British, than the English. Perhaps Louis simply refused. But what it did, of course, ladies and gentlemen, was to leave a tremendous gap. Here you've got an invader coming in who was not sworn to the charter. Nevertheless, Louis's intervention is disastrous for John. He's having had a period of major and highly active activity, terrible phrase, vigorous activity. Having had a period of vigorous activity, he lapses into one of those semi-catatonic, drunken stages in which he spends far too much time in Corfe Castle, in the far west country and so on. And Louis quickly sweeps up all of the great fortresses, and remember, England is held down by fortresses. So what he does, the barons have got London, and he picks off one by one the great royal castles until you've only got Windsor, you've got Lincoln, and you've got one other whose name temporarily slips my mind left. At that point, John swept up, he's in East Anglia. There is the famous crossing of the Wash. He dies, and it looks at that point as though England is genuinely lost. His again is the first royal will, written quickly to dictate. It actually survives. The document dictated by his bed actually survives. He had intended to be buried at Beaulieu Abbey, which is the great abbey that he founds, but of course that, along with all the royal castles, apart from, Lincoln, Windsor and Dover. How could I be so stupid? That's why he can still get the stuff over from continental Europe. The whole of the south, apart from those castles, including Beaulieu Abbey, where he'd wanted to be buried, is held. So he takes a decision, again on his deathbed. I'm not quite sure everybody has fully understood the implications. He decides he wants to be buried at Worcester because his favourite saint is St. Wulstan. So his body is taken over to Worcester along with those who surrounded him and the will. And they bear with them a testimony which I believe, that he'd chosen a regent for his son, the child, little very young boy, Henry III. And the man chosen was William the Marshal, the man that I describe as the first conservative statesman in England. And Marshal is now confronted by this apparent complete disaster. The capital, the whole of the south, large parts of South Wales are all in the hands of an acclaimed foreign monarch. He's not crowned, but he has been acknowledged as king. What is he going to do? And you've just got this little boy, his mother, and a tiny court. He does a remarkable and very courageous thing. Just a quick interpolation here. We were talking earlier in the introduction about necessary virtues. Can I tell you what I think is the most necessary virtue? It's called courage. And without courage, nothing matters. And the entire career of William the Marshal, who had risen, he's a fascinating figure. He's both a sportsman, he's a kind of successful Seb Coe. He is the greatest jouster of the period at a time when, of course, if you're a successful jouster, you took the horse, the armor, and sometimes even the lands of the man you defeated. So you build up a really big purse, it's really big time stuff. He also marries an extremely rich wife, which gives him most of Ireland, which is a handy bonus. Anyway, he takes remarkably a decision, along with one other person, the papal legate Pandulf, who again is acting as sort of representative of England's overlord. And they take a double decision. First, the boy king is going to be crowned. They have none of the regalia. It's all in London. It's all at Westminster Abbey. And so they just knock it up. They more or less, he's more or less clad in a pair of curtains. A woman's garland is used as the crown on his head, but he is invested solemnly as a king. This little boy is invested as a king. And remember, actually crowned. Remember, this is vitally important, because at that time, you're not regarded as a king simply by virtue of succession. You're only regarded as a king if you've been crowned and anointed. A regnal year does not begin at the moment of accession, it begins at the moment of anointing. So the little boy is crowned and anointed. They then take a breather, and they're going down now the Welsh marches. They then go down to Bristol, where the second huge decision is taken. We will reissue the charter. That vacuum which has been left by Louis not issuing the charter is now to be filled by a royal reissue of the charter. But it's a very, very different charter. You have made it a conservative document. All of those radical clauses are simply struck out without being spoken about. There are a few other awkward clauses that were also somewhat difficult, and again, as a sort of indication that this is the first great conservative moment in English history. How do you deal with the other contentious clauses? Ladies and gentlemen, you set up a committee. And they are solemnly referred to the committee as being of too weighty importance to be hastily decided. So they die quietly and unlamented in the corner. But it's this Magna Carta of 1216, not the Magna Carta of 1215, which is the fundamental document, because that preserves all the good clauses, all the ones, as I said, the rights of the church, the rights of the City of London, the interests of the City of London, the broad regularization of law, the promise of justice, all of that we regard as the central elements of Magna Carta are preserved. And the problematic, the deeply contentious, the effective creation of a royal republic. And just so quickly, I just want to maybe not even a royal republic, can I just give you an idea of how radically, once it came to open civil war between John and the barons, those clauses, the former securitatis had been used, the barons had used the machinery of the 25 and the quorum of 4 actually to set up an anti-royal government. They had started issuing writs and commands without mentioning a king. They dated them by the year of grace with no mention of a sovereign. This is genuine. Before Cromwell, before the American Revolution, this is a genuinely unkinged world that they did. Not a bit of it whilst you have William the Marshal around. So what you've got now is a reissued charter, and a reissued charter with, as it were, a purge having been performed on it. But of course, this is a little boy. So the charter has got to be issued, not over his seal. By the way, another quick note, Magna Carta is never signed. Please, kings are not yet literate. They're sealed. And so this Magna Carta is sealed by the seals of William the Marshal and the papal legate. But there is still civil war. The Louis comes back again. Again, there is a characteristic sort of dying down of activity between the late autumn of 1216, when you get that sequence of the coronation and the reissuing of the charters. And then the following spring, Louis comes back. There is renewed intense baronial activity. And the barons, once again, they're occupying London. They've got all of those castles. There's still only Lincoln and Dover and Windsor of the great castles surviving. But of course, the barons are doing what? These are vigorous, bold people, and they're essentially cooped up in London. They like fighting. Really very important. One of the things that we've forgotten is an awful lot of men do just like fighting. We're going to have to rediscover this, and although it's always nowadays denounced very shrewishly as toxic masculinity, there are all kinds of circumstances when it comes in quite handy. If you remember the chap who sort of took out single-handed the knife man in the damned square now, good Brit, with a very vigorous display of elegant toxic masculinity. Well, the barons are about as toxically masculine as you can come. And so, of course, they're cooped up in London. So they decide they want a bit of fun. So they go off to have a siege, and they've left London. The forces are split. William the Marshal, the great hero of the tournament, knows exactly what to do. The barons are lured off to Lincoln. And William the Marshal has got contacts there and knows exactly what the geographical layout of Lincoln is. And Lincoln, those of you who've been there, is almost as remarkable as Salisbury, though it has to be said nothing like as beautiful. Or there's one tiny bit that is very wonderful. It's two towns. You've got the medieval settlement on the plain, which is now a genuine horror. It's one of the ugliest places in Britain, and that is saying something. And then you've got up on top of it's a volcanic plug of the Roman city of Lindum, very much then as now, to the eastern side of it, you've got the cathedral. To the west, you've got the castle. There's an open space between the two. There's most of the Roman wall going down it. And there's this incredible thing called Steep Street, which lives very much up to its name, with one of, I think, the oldest inhabited house in the country, the Jews' house, which goes back to before Magna Carta. So it witnessed everything that then happens. And there is then this extraordinary moment of the battle in which William the Marshal captures the French who are besieging the castle. So they're in that narrow space between the front of the cathedral and the castle. He takes them from the rear and they find themselves trapped. And there's a great set-piece demonstration. William the Marshal, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is 70. He's in full armor. And he leads his troops, and he personally cuts down the commander of the French, the Comte du Perche, who is actually his cousin. And it's one of these extraordinary moments. Of course, it's chivalric combat. He strikes him. The man falls off his horse. They think he's just injured. They, again, treated chivalrously. The helmet is removed, and a sword has gone through the eye. But there's this extraordinary moment at which the French forces are trapped, and there's a huge capture of virtually all the leaders of the opposition. So now we have the young lad vindicated, we have the new Magna Carta entrenched, and everything looks fairly hunky-dory. But there are many problems. The problem's that there is still a minority. William the Marshal is going to die. And there's also the problem of what is the actual authority of that Magna Carta, just sealed as it is by the seals of his guardians. What is the boy going to do when he grows up? And he's now growing up, he's coming towards his majority. Is he going to become a John? Or is he going to become a William the Marshal? Is he going to reenact that charter on his own authority, or is he not? And at this point, the man who'd played a very important part in the first Magna Carta, the 1215 Magna Carta, though then had found himself completely undercut by Innocent III, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, who'd been exiled, is allowed to come back from his exile and resumes his leading role. Remember, in those days, the Archbishop of Canterbury is not normally a leftist troublemaker. He is usually the Lord Chancellor and the King's, how times change, and the King's principal advisor. And Langton assumed that role. And he also hastens the King's majority. He gives him his own seal, and then he does something very remarkable. In 1225, the charter is going to be reissued. But once again, the French have come in really useful. Oh, by the way, we should really have finished off Louis. How does William the Marshal get rid of Louis? He buys him off. This is really interesting. It's not what you might expect, grand gesture. It's how do we solve a problem as neatly and quickly as possible. And at no stage, as I said, did William the Marshal invoke treason. Even when, in that summer of 1217, in the run-up to the Battle of Lincoln, the English troops were actually blessed by the Pope's legate. A crusade is actually proclaimed against the barons. You never proclaim them traitor. The result is you can then have, once they've been defeated, once the barons have been defeated honorably by the best jouster, by William the Marshal, you can have a kind of settlement which says, well, basically sort of no hard feelings. You've won. See, this is aristocratic politics. You've won. It's been an honest, fair fight. Okay, let's shake hands and sort of forget. And it is quite remarkable, again, as after the Civil War and the restoration of 1660, we avoid that terrible purge We avoid the sort of things that happened, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. Anyway, that was just to interpolate there. The final, as it were, this element of settling down, this element of consolidation. But it's even more than that, because I think Stephen Langton is the only person I've been rather, how can I say, dismissive, the rude remarks that I made about Oakeshott and Scruton. I've been perhaps excessively dismissive of principle. Langton is the only person in all of this, I think, who had genuine principle. Langton had a vision of a commune, that he actually uses that word, communitas, of the country, in which every free man at least was properly involved, and the great principle of canon law, that which touches everybody should be decided by everybody. And circumstances with France, again, Louis is now king. Louis intervened to trim young Henry III of yet more of his French lands, including Poitou. The English are persuaded to raise a tax to pay for the recapture of Poitou. It doesn't matter. It doesn't happen, but that doesn't matter. What matters is the nature of that tax. The tax is a universal tax on all free men. And the reissue of the Charter is given in return for that tax. So you immediately establish what becomes the fundamental principle of Parliament, which is the grant of supply in return for redress of grievance. The Charter is also different in other ways. It's now not issued with the advice of the barons. It's issued on the mere motion of the king. That's the usual form of a royal grant. And it's sealed only with his seal and with the barons simply acting as witnesses. In other words, this is the Charter as it becomes fully mature. It is now the 1216 Magna Carta, with some additions from the Charter of the Forest and all the rest of it, consciously granted to everybody in the country in return for the support of the monarchy in the defense of the realm and the defense of the interests of the king, and with an assertion that it is an unforced, obviously the earlier Magna Carta, the first Magna Carta, had been an extorted document. This is a document done freely, with goodwill on both sides, and executed under the seal of the king. And then the final stage of this process of high legitimation is the reissue. The reissues go on and go on and go on. The reissue of 1253. And the reissue of 1253, again, shows another very important face. The original attitude of the Church to Magna Carta, as we've seen, had been very, very ambivalent. The original Magna Carta had actually been declared illegitimate by the Pope. And there is then this, particularly as led by Langton, this full absorption in the Church, in the processes of Magna Carta. And this culminates in 1253 in the most extraordinary spectacle, which is a reenactment of a grand ceremonial reenactment of Magna Carta, now at the heart of the English monarchy, where it still is, where, by the way, we have just celebrated the conclusion of a day of Ramadan as another feature of our modern traditional politics. In Westminster Hall, there is this extraordinary sight of the reproclamation of Magna Carta and the solemn curse and excommunication of the Church on anybody who shall breach it. So you actually have all of the bishops and the clergy. It must have been an extraordinary spectacle. They are all there. We've even got music to accompany it. There must have been an extraordinary spectacle. All the clergy are there with flaming candles. You get the proclamation to the sound of organs and trumpets, of and the tolling of bells, of the solemn anathema. That is to say, anybody who breaches Magna Carta is excluded from the community of the faithful and shall go straight down to hell. All the candles are turned over. They're snuffed out. This stench arises. The king had been in other words, you reenact hell. for anybody who shall breach Magna Carta. And the king had been offered a candle, but he says, although I'm anointed and I'm not quite an ordinary man, I cannot do that. So he's like an American president. He stands there with his right hand over his heart, looking terribly solemn as all this is going on. And that's the moment at which Magna Carta, I think, becomes mythic. It becomes the guarantor. So we can see that process within the life of this little boy of what I call the transformation of a revolutionary document into a fundamentally conservative document. And I think what we've got to do, we've to understand that until 1997, the whole of our history is that kind of process of the leap forward, the radical leap forward, the bit far, isn't it? Hadn't we better go back and yes, we had. And it is a properly Burkean process. It is a process behind us here, which draws from the past, considers the realities of the present, and shapes the future. And it's one that we have to go back to. We've to stop this absurd infatuation with novelty. The problem from 1997 onwards is we thought to change made it better. Even the Conservative Party proclaims that it's got to modernize, for God's sake. If we look now at the absolutely comprehensive mess of our constitution, of our public life that has followed the changes of 1997, we can see what a disaster, shallow, rootless modernization is. And again, we were talking earlier about the business of change. The best conservative account of change isn't actually Burke, it is Disraeli, a man, of course, who, because of the 19th century and the vast changes of the 19th century, confronted them. And Disraeli, in two of his last great speeches, the Crystal Palace speech and the one in the Free Trade Hall in Manchester, by the way, you've heard my slight tension of my throat. Disraeli dealt with it. These were speeches that lasted at least 2 hours. Disraeli dealt with it by 2 bottles of brandy per speech. I am not quite sure what the... But can you imagine trying to fill the Free Trade Hall without amplification? The level of dramatic performance that you would have had to have done. What we've got to understand is what Disraeli was saying when through the 2 bottles of brandy. And if the transcripts are accurate, he said something very remarkable. He said, change in a progressive, he actually calls England a progressive country. Change in a progressive country like England is inevitable and is good. The question is not shall there be change, but what sort of change? Shall it be change in accordance with the traditions of the country or in accordance with the abstract rules of international liberalism? He actually puts it in those words in the 1860s. Quite astonishing. And ladies and gentlemen, all the changes that I've been trying to describe when I've been touring the country, which is why I'm less than fresh today, arguing for the need of a great repeal act of the changes that were made under Blair. All the changes that were made under Blair were in accordance with the abstract doctrines of international liberalism, exactly the kind of thing that Burke denounces with the changes of the French Revolution. And what they all do is destroy the constitution which had been gently and progressively deduced from Magna Carta. Remember, you can draw a complete line from Magna Carta through the struggles of Simon de Montfort, who represents the baronial clause, and the Prince Edward and the Lord Edward, who is a kind of successor of William the Marshal, the formation of Parliament, Civil War, the Glorious Revolution, the creation of the office of Prime Minister. They all follow a sequence. And the central principle is that idea enunciated in 1225, sketched in the earlier good section of Magna Carta of 1215, that the governed have got a right to be involved in government, that there is Magna Carta as the origins of representative government, as it's fully developed by the idea of Parliament in the as early as the 14th century. Everybody is bound by what is decided in Parliament because everybody is in Parliament. You're either in Parliament in person or by your representative, which is why we have had always a different attitude to law from countries that have been subject to Roman law and absolute monarchy. The law is ours because we make it. It's why we could have the notion of policing by consent rather than policing by armed force, though of course with the behavior of the police, which is testified to daily, that consent is being eroded and I'm afraid replaced by contempt, but that is another and deplorable matter. But ladies and gentlemen, what Blair did was deliberately to destroy that idea. Power was deliberately removed from Parliament in two directions. One towards so-called expert quangos, the Monetary Policy Committee, Climate Change Committee, English Nature, and in the other towards legal institutions. And the result is that Parliament essentially has got little or no power, as this government is actually discovering to my immense satisfaction. And as we can end with that gloat, can I throw it back to you? Thank you.
Hello, David. You mentioned there was a couple of Magna Cartas signed during this course. Which ones?
He's just asking which version of the Magna Carta is in Salisbury.
The 1215 Magna Carta in Salisbury. Very few copies of the 1216 Magna Carta survive. Again, it's very interesting why there are so relatively few copies of the Magna Carta of 1215 surviving. I think it's because it took so long. It's 4,000 words. To copy that on a huge it's called a skin of part. It's a sheep. It's a sheep. Remember, the size of a document is limited by the size of a sheep. So that's what it is. It's a skin, or if you're being fancy, skein of parchment. That's what it is. And a 4,000-word document like that, like the full text of Magna Carta, would have taken a highly skilled clerk some weeks. In other words, remember, the Magna Carta of 1215 only survives as a document from June to October. There simply isn't time to multiply copies. What we have virtually the writs for virtually all the counties, because the writs are very different. They're short documents, and they're designed to be written to dictation. Their equivalent of doing multi-copying is you would have a group of clerks all lined up, and the master clerk would dictate, and they'd write the abbreviated Latin to dictation. So if you've got, say, half a dozen clerks of the Chancery, you can do 6 writs. It's not bad, is it? You can do 6. This is the origins of bureaucracy, the mass production of documents. Again, they're taught a standard form of handwriting. The writs are virtually indestructible. Parchment is sheepskin, which is one of the toughest things. When, for example, the Royal Archives, the National Archives, were being rebuilt in the Victorian period, the way they dealt with the documents was to pile them up outside and then cover them with the Exchequer records that we used as tarpaulin. And they actually survive it. I mean, it's completely extraordinary. They actually survive it. When you get famous stories like rebellious barons forcing sheriffs and messengers to eat a royal writ, it was a very terrifying experience, because you not only have that parchment, which I imagine is more or less the equivalent of very large and indigestible scratching, but you've got a wax seal. You die. Got a wax seal like that. So this is a 1215 Magna Carta.
Okay, next question.
Lady here?
Lady here, yeah.
Hi, slightly off topic, but what do you think of Philippa Gregory's theory that the Tudors got rid of the princes in the tower?
Oh, I think Philippa Gregory is the higher rubbish. I don't mind. It's fine to use history as fiction, but don't expect to be taken seriously. And don't wave a doctorate around when you're doing it. In the same way, Wolf Hall is fiction. The idea that it contains novel insights is absurd. The picture of Thomas Cromwell and Thomas More is just a parody of my old great teacher, Geoffrey Elton. I say that Mantell is just Geoffrey Elton with adjectives. And it's not too bad with Cromwell, except, of course, can there have been a less convincing version of Cromwell than Mark Rylance? All sorts of like this. Cromwell's a great thug. A very, very intelligent thug. He'd been a mercenary. And all this internal landscape, I really don't think Cromwell very much worried about internal landscapes. I really don't. But there we are. But it's fine that it gets people interested and excited. But the problem is it's very easy for people, again, when there are this strange mixture of absolute fantasy and absolute resolute attempt at the reproduction of the last detail of costume, and then you have a black queen. This strange, uneasy relationship we have with historical verisimilitude, and where it can be challenged and where it can't.
Roland, sorry, there was somebody over this side as well.
Hello. Would you repeal every law made since 1997?
Would I?
Repeal every law made since 1997?
I'm very sorry.
Would you repeal every law?
No. Thank you. Forgive me. It's just elderly hearing, which fails, as I'm sure many other elderly people in this room will know, and the amplification is designed to go in that direction. I would repeal all the principal constitutional legislation. If anybody, and I think it's important that we address why. Some of you may have seen I've been going around the country. I've been, atheist, evangelizing on this subject. I also wrote the piece in The Spectator, which seems to have established the language, the ideal of a great repeal act to be followed by a restoration. The reason I think that is that not only is there what I've described now, not only is there the business of the Quangoification of Britain. And remember, we have got an illustration of why a Quango government, why the rule of a single expert committee was an absolute catastrophe, because that is how we were ruled during COVID. SAGE was exactly that committee. It was a committee of very distinguished epidemiologists and absolutely terrible statisticians. Why anybody has ever taken a single thing that Neil Ferguson said seriously is beyond me. He was the one who got... He was the one who got foot and mouth wrong. He was the one who got BSE wrong. Why on earth he should have been expected to get COVID right is beyond me. But remember, a single issue committee, by definition, has got a single goal. The single goal of the COVID committee was to make sure nobody died of COVID. It did not matter if they died of cancer. It was positively shoulder-shrugging if they died of heart disease. And who gave a damn about the education of children or the fact that we completely buggered our economy? You see, this is the problem with single-issue expert rule. It's why you have a cabinet, or you used to have a cabinet. It's why, again, I see politics. I want to reassert the importance of politics. The whole point of the Blairite Constitution was to deny the importance of politics. What does Starmer say when he's asked Westminster or Davos? He says, I can't stand Westminster and politics Davos. This is the mentality. It's disastrous because, of course, he represents the other side, and arguably the even more terrible side of the 1997 settlement, which is the legal side of that settlement. And as we all know, it consists of two separate things. It consists of the incorporation of specific legislation, and then it consists also of the creation of the Supreme Court and an extraordinary notion of the rule of law, which elevates the rule of law above politics. This is catastrophic. Again, we had the opening in which we talked about culture. I think we've got to be so much more specific. What the left has done is capture language. This is why the last chapter of 1984 is about Newspeak. He understood, Orwell understood completely the importance of words. The left has captured language. Look, right, the incorporation of the European Convention on Human Rights. Human rights, they're pure Paddington Bear. You know, a sweet little bear that came from Peru with a little label round itself and with sort of little echoes of, you know, fleeing Jews and poor little refugees and poor little evacuees, and we all cry and become awfully sentimental. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at what the hard facts are. If you believe in either European or universal human rights, you believe there is a source of law which sits above the state, i.e. you can't do anything about it. Secondly, you believe that the state probably shouldn't exist. If there are universal human rights, it means there's a universal human being. It means there's no difference between a newly landed immigrant who sort of wielded the odd machete in darkest Africa, I think it still exists, or Afghanistan, and you and me. It means probably there shouldn't be any frontiers at all. We've got to repossess language. And the thing that's even more shocking is how human rights are described by the judge who is largely responsible for the creation of the legal architecture of Blair. That's the late Tom Bingham. And I am now quoting directly. Admittedly, he said it in Australia. He didn't dare to say it here. What he said is this: human rights laws are explicitly anti-democratic and counter-majoritarian. They are to privilege the minority. And then he lists the minorities: the mentally sick, Rudakabane, Kalakana. Actually, the mad way in which we now treat the mad. The answer to, you know, both Kalakane and Rudakabane isn't to witter on about terrorism. It is that manifestly these people should have been locked up from early teenage, as we always used to in secure asylums, which we need to reopen so that we don't just have one of them at Broadmoor. There need to be, as there were Victorians, again, always correctly realised, we need those. Unfortunately, they were demolished by the left because they interfered with freedom and Foucault's weird notion that madness was simply a social construct. And of course, they were demolished by the right because they would they'd sell off and make absolutely wonderful flats, wouldn't they? And so we carry a precisely equal degree of blame. And then the absolute nonsense of the Equality Act, because again, the moment you protect a minority, you, as Enoch Powell fully realised, you automatically disempower the majority. The debate that we're now having on sentencing. But ladies and gentlemen, as I've just pointed out, if you already have a legal system that through human rights that privileges minorities, when you were talking about two-tier, this is not simply a term of abuse. It is actually now written into the law. The idea of equality before the law has been stood on its head. But the most absurd thing about the Equality Act, does anybody here know it? It actually contains equations. And the equations contain the maddest economic theory of all, which is the Marxist labour theory of value. And it's on the basis of the labour theory of value that judges have ruled on what men and women should be paid, which is why you bankrupted Birmingham to the tune of £500 million, why you're about to bankrupt Next on exactly the same grounds. It is lunatic that judges should be setting wages. The same way that the Climate Change Act passed by a Conservative Prime Minister, by Theresa May, gives judges the power to determine whether we can frack or whether we can drill in the North Sea. It's utterly demented. But the worst thing of them all is the creation of the Supreme Court, the development of this notion of the rule of law. And we've seen the big example. The big example, of course, is the decision of the Supreme Court, led by Brenda Hale of the Spider, that a law court could actually could rule a piece of parliamentary management, that's to say, prorogation, illegal. That reverses the Bill of Rights. I could not comprehend how somebody as able as Jonathan Sumption could go along with that verdict. It shocked me to the core. But the problem is, it is now intrinsic in this idea of the rule of law, which has imitated American federal Germany and deliberately diminishes politics and puts legal structures on top. And the only thing to do is to get rid of the lot of it. It's going to be profoundly difficult. One of the things we're all working on now, what is the legal, administrative, prerogative machinery that you would actually need to do this. It will be fought absolutely tooth and nail. But what is very striking is that the more intelligent members of the Labour government are realising it's going to have to be done. Wes Streeting is talking openly on this. At least one MP has called directly for disaffiliation from the European Convention. And one of them, I've now forgotten his name, but he clearly is very bright, has adopted the complete Starkey agenda. So,
I think we're going to have to conclude the questions there just because of time. But what we're going to do is have a quick break now for about 20 minutes. David kindly has offered to sign any copies of his book in the interval, if anybody wants to purchase them or has already purchased a copy. So if you would want to, please form an orderly queue up to the bookstore here. David will do some signings, and we'll convene in about 20-25 minutes for the next speaker. Thank you. Thank you, David. Fantastic.
Our mission at the New Culture Forum is and always has been to defend and celebrate Britain's history, culture and its people, and indeed Western civilization, at a time when both are under sustained attack. We have grown from small beginnings to become the country's most influential right-leaning cultural think tank. Our content is watched and read by some of Britain's most influential political figures. But now, we need your help. If you believe in what we do, then please do become a member. For as little as £4 a month, you can make a vital contribution to what we do. As a member of the NCF family, you will help ensure that we can continue to produce quality content online, such as our 3 weekly programmes, Whittle, which is our flagship interview show, Newspeak, our panel discussion show, and Deprogrammed, which is targeted at Britain's youth. As you probably know, in addition, we produce important documentaries, such as our critically acclaimed 6-part series, The West, a stunning celebration of the history and genius of Western civilization, and our ongoing documentary series, Heresies, with hard-hitting episodes tackling subjects such as immigration, gender ideology, and BBC bias. But the New Culture Forum is much more than a YouTube channel. We don't just complain about Britain as it is, we provide real solutions and clear policies on how we can push back against the madness and restore sanity to this nation. Our presenters are now highly sought after and have become familiar faces across the media. Our prestigious annual Smith Lecture and our regional and indeed national conferences have attracted world-class speakers. Perhaps most importantly, we are the only organisation on the right of politics that has launched a national movement without actually being a political party. And uniquely, through our NCF Locals programme, we've established some 30 active branches in towns and cities right across the nation, from Edinburgh to Exeter, and with many more on the way. We're very proud of what we've achieved, and our members have made it possible. In return, our members receive access to exclusive content, invitations to private events, free or discounted tickets to our conferences and lectures, free copies of our books, and much more. I very much hope that you'll join us too by clicking the link in the description or going to our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Now is the time that we need your help. Thank you.